Okay, I would like us to start. We have very interesting webinar for you today, and there is quite a bit of information, so we shouldn't delay. So as you know, the webinar will be recorded. So let's start. And that will be with official welcome from the University of Florida. My name is Agata Kowalewska. I'm faculty in the Center for European Studies. The center is also Jean Monnet Center of Excellence, and it's a Title VI National Resource Center for Europe. The center is housed in the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, and we are multidisciplinary area and language studies unit. Two housekeeping rules. One is that, as I mentioned at the very beginning, the webinar will be recorded, and after conclusion, it will be posted into the center's YouTube channel. So if you miss any of our previous webinars, they are there, or they will be shortly there. The other part is that if you would like to ask a question, we are planning on Q&A at the end of the webinar, and please submit them through the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. So what are we doing today? Our presenter today is Dr. Juan Antonio Álvarez-Pedrosa, and he will talk about the Restless Dead and the Slavic gods and goddesses of death and the underworld. Dr. Álvarez-Pedrosa is a professor of Indo-European linguistics at the Complutense University of Madrid. For many years, he has been in charge of the teaching Old Church Slavonic and has directed several doctoral theses on the medieval Slavic studies. One of his main lines of research is a study of medieval texts and the way how they give us information about Slavic paganism and processes of Christianizations among Slavs. His research culminated in publication of the book titled Sources for the Study of Pre-Christian Slavic Religion. The book was published in 2020. Together with Dr. Enrique Santos Marinas, who was a speaker at our previous webinar, they published a book about the pre-Christian Slavic religion. And if you would like to have more information about the book, please, I'm referring you to our previous webinar. So right now, I am turning off my microphone, and our speaker, Dr. Juan Antonio Álvarez-Pedrosa.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your kind presentation, Agata, dear Agata. And I begin with my presentation. Okay. The beginning is a contextualization of the early Slavic testimonies about the restless dead. The figure of the vampire as a terrifying being that feeds on the blood of the living, never dies and lives at night, is a horror myth that has become very popular in Western popular culture. We have all seen several movies about it and read more than one book based on the vampire. The myth has had several recreations in the novel and the cinema. In popular imagination, his figure has been fixed from the film Nosferatu, directed by Friedrich Wilhelm Murnau. The popularity of the vampire in European and Western culture was born in 1898 with the publication of Bram Stoker's novel Dracula. In it, a mysterious Count of Transylvania travels to London, where he seeks to increase his harem of women on whose blood he feeds and whom he turns into living dead. The vampire is described as a force of evil, endowed with unique powers such as transformation into animals or mist, telepathy, control of repulsive beings such as rats or bats. He has, however, weak points, such as the impossibility of acting in daylight, and can be cancelled by means of sacred objects, holy water, the sacred host, the crucifix, and definitively eliminated if decapitated or staked through the head. It is important to note that this latest detail, because at the time when Stoker wrote his novel, the cancellation of the presumed living dead by means of prophylactic burials, in which a dead person who, according to popular belief, could become a harmful living dead, was buried with large stone on his head or with a sickle on his neck to prevent him from rising from his grave, had been enforced in some areas of Eastern Europe until the beginning of the 19th century. We will return to this later. The very term vampire becomes from the Slavic languages, Serbian vampir, Russian upir. He has been one of the most powerful motivations to consider that the vampire is a belief that arises in the Slavic sphere since the times of the common Slavic and spread from the Great Slavic expansion, 6th and 7th century AD, through Central and Eastern Europe. Although for a long time it was thought that the author was inspired by the historical figure of the Wallachian Count Vlad the Impaler, a Romanian condottiero famous for his act of cruelty in his fight against the Ottomans and in internal repressions, and of the Hungarian Countess Elizabeth Báthory, to whom legend attributes the sinister habit of bathing in the blood of young maidens to remain eternally young, it seemed that Stoker's saucers were more varied and somehow more complex. According to a character in the novel, Dr. Van Helsing, the vampire is known everywhere. He has followed his trail among the Icelandic berserkers, the Huns, the Slavs, the Saxons, and the Magyars. That is to say, he takes for granted the theory of a great diffusion of the figure of vampires, whose origins he placed in Germanic peoples, as well as in the Slavs and Central Asians who settled in the center of Europe. The character of Van Helsing, like so many others of the same period, is part of the theory of racial cultural diffusions. In reality, much more than historical figures such as Count Vlad, the Impaler, or Countess Báthory, Dracula is inspired by figures that exist through the Central and Eastern European medieval tradition, which are the so-called Restless Dead, or in its French versions, the Revenants. It is those who return from the grave. Who are the restless dead in European Middle Ages? They are people who come out of the grave and return among the living to do harm, although not always, as we will see in the nuance of these definitions. They will be responsible for unexplained death and above all for the death of small children. We find stories of the living dead in Irish, Germanic, and Slavic folk traditions, but also medieval monastic stories. So it is not an exclusively popular tradition. We also find it widely developed in a cultural environment, especially in medieval monastic literature and in the Latin hagiography of the European Middle Ages. Although Bram Stoker does not reveal his sources, many of them are contained in the folkloric realm of the many Central European traditions he may have known and which were extraordinarily alive at the time he conceived and wrote his novel Dracula. The best-known theory that explains the genesis of the figure of the restless dead is the one created by the semanticists Ouspensky and Lotman in 1994. It is the so-called theory of binary stratification, which stated that the restless dead emerges as a result of the superimposition of two fundamental ideological strata, A first and oldest pagan substratum where the conception of the restless death of aggressive characteristics would pre-exist. On this stratum will be superimposed a superstratum product of the Christianization of the Germanic and Slavic peoples, which conflict with the traditional pagan ideology. In a way, Uspensky and Lotman embed their theory in a cultural concept of cultural class struggle against the Christianization preached and sponsored by the cultural elites of Christian Europe, both in its Eastern and Western version, the people maintain as a countercultural current and in an expression of resistance of the new religions introduced by the elites. Their cultural concept of the living dead, permitting the cultural of the elites who end up assuming this figure. However, as we are going to see, the theory of binary stratification has some problems that confront the textual data itself. In the first place, it is not so clear that the restless death is a pre-existing cultural concept, therefore, from the Slavic or Germanic prehistoric period. But it seems that it is born in the ancient or the medieval period and conditioned by a series of facts that we will comment on. Nor it is clear that it is arose in a popular environment because the testimonies in monastic literature are among the oldest that collect the data on this figure. And finally, not all the living dead are necessarily aggressive, as we will see in more detail. To adequately explain the origin and characteristic of the pre-modern European restless dead, since they not only appear in the Middle Ages, but as we have seen, survive in popular culture until the 19th century, we must reconsider many of the things we know about the paganism of the Indo-European peoples of Western Europe. In that sense, it is seminal to read the book of Ken Dowden, who in his European paganism, the realities of cult from antiquity to the Middle Ages, describes the European paganisms in their Indo-European context and discovers that many of the academic works carried out to that time fail to understand the main essence of paganism, which is not a religion based on faith, but speaks the language of action, the language of ritual. This conceptual error begins already with the Christian apologists of the Roman imperial period, who are describing a new religion, that is Christianity, which is based first and foremost on faith, contrasting in those same terms to a paganism that already in their time was highly discredited for not attending to more philosophical and abstract concepts and has been sclerotized as a ritualism that gave very little sense to the social demands of the time. During the medieval Christianization of the Germanic and Slavic peoples, the same type of unrequited dialogue took place, for while the pagans understood their religion as something based on ritual that served to unite and give identity to their respective peoples, the Christian missionaries spoke to them of a faith in much more abstract terms. This led to such curious phenomena as we find, for example, in a very interesting 9th century text entitled Answer of Pope Nicholas I to the Queries of Bulgarians, in which Pope Nicholas I answered by letter to a series of doubts raised by the ruler of the Bulgarian, the Kagan Boris, who had just converted to Christianity in 865 under the new name of Michael. The Bulgarian ruler, who wanted to obtain the privilege of creating an autocephalous patriarchal see for his kingdom, wrote both to the Patriarch of Constantinople, Photius, and to the Pope of Rome, with a series of doubts about his new religion, among which he slipped his claim to obtain a patriarchal see. The replay of Photius is very interesting because it leaves us one of the first medieval testimonies of the genre, literary genre that we know as the Mirror of Princes. But even more interesting is the response of Nicholas, because he answered in terms of faith to the question of Boris and Michael, when all the questions of the neophyte refer to question of praxis. An impossible dialogue is thus produced in which some, the pagan who converts to Christianity, continue to speak and think of religion in terms of ritual and orthopraxis, while the Christian elites maintain a parallel discourse based on faith. This importance of ritual in the cultural and daily life of the peoples of Central and Eastern Europe is, in my opinion, the reason for the appearance of this curious figure of the restless dead, as a result of the collective trauma that means for them the sudden change of funeral rite, which for them was cremation in a generalized way, while the new faith, Christianity, imposed burial without exception, in the confidence that the dead, at the end of the time, would rise in a glorious body. Therefore, cremation was absolutely forbidden as a funeral rite. A change of ritual is not simple, not even a simple rite, a simple change. Collective cling to their way of understanding rituals, and when they occur, they are slow changes that even remain in time much longer than could be expected. Suffice it to allude to the change of ritual in 1988, reform of the Mass in the Catholic Church brought about with the introduction of vernacular languages and the simplification of the ritual. However, we know that the ancient rite was preserved, albeit in a residual form in several communities, and now is re-emerging to become a strong current in France and the United States, for instance. My colleague Enrique Santos has already explained it with many texts that the usual funeral ritual among the Slavs, or both among the Western Slav as well as among the Southern and Eastern Slavs, was cremation. We know that this was the widespread ritual among the Germanic people. The Christian imposition of burial was a very abrupt change, which gave rise to the idea that those who had not received a correct burial from the Christian point of view, whatever this violation was, there are many types, as we will now see, should return to life. This return can happen in a sinister way, causing damage to the whole environment, but we find many testimonies of the return to life that still fear but are not aggressive. The conflict that arises when a dead person is not buried with the proper rites and some fundamental feature of the rites is violated comes from ancient times and is at the origin of one of the oldest ghost stories in Western literature, the story of the ghost of the house of Athens, transmitted by the Roman author Pliny the Younger in his letter 7. The text is the one in the handout. More or less, the story is tell about a Greek philosopher, Athenodorus, who rented a house in Athens that was cursed. At night, a skeletal old man with a long beard and unkempt hair would appear. He wore chains on his hand and feet and made a noise with them. Athenodorus and faced resist like a good philosopher the fear that the apparition wants to steal in him and discovers that the reason the dead man appears is that he did not receive the proper funeral rites and was buried in the wrong place, along with the chains that indicated that he must have been a slave, or a prisoner. Once the prescribed funeral rites have been performed, the living dead does not appear. It is striking that in such an ancient text are already from the second century before Christ, no, in AD, the text appear already some of the most common features that we attribute to the restless dead, and by extension to the figure of the dead who come back to life, not to do harm, but to frighten the living to meet the demands that only the philosopher, as a cultivated person, is able to understand. The sinister noise of the chains is even today a constant in ghost stories. Athenodorus' attitude of indifferent serenity is, in many centuries later, parodied in the Otis Family by Oscar Wilde in the Canterville Ghost. In addition, the text of Pliny the Younger shows us that the origin of the figure of the restless death is not exclusively popular, but has a cultural side, and above all proves the importance of ritual in the origin of the belief, because what matters to us from the text is that once the prescribed rituals are performed, the living dead no longer reappear. In the late antique times, a Christian author gives us a version very similar to that of Pliny the Younger. Constantius of Lyon, in the 5th century AD, applies the same narrative to a saint Christian bishop, who in the new religion is the equivalent of the imperturbable philosopher. The Christian saint whose life Constantius narrates is Saint Germain of Auxerre, and in his chapter 10 of the Vita Sancti Germani, he tells the same story. A restless dead appeared to the saint in a terrifying house because they are unburied, the undead have to scare them people, for they have no rest. The next morning, the saint finds the chained bones of the dead, probably executed, and gives them a Christian burial, so they no longer reappear. It is likely that Constantius of Lyon knew the work of Pliny the Younger. This is an author who gives important news about the early Christians and about the persecutions of Trajan, the Emperor Trajan. So it is likely that he was read in the Christian schools. But it is interesting that in this case, the narrative elements are the same. The dead who appear at night have been buried as criminals with their chains without receiving a proper burial. Only when the bishop ordered the proper rites to be fulfilled, on this occasion adjusted to the Christian rituals, the problem is solved. In the Middle Ages, another type of living dead became very popular, the incandescent dead. There are many stories of apparitions that appear surrounded by fire, with incandescent aspect or with igneous clothes. Medieval Christian tradition makes them messengers of the punishment of hell or of the fiery punishment of purgatory. Still today, we can visit in Rome the Museum of the Museo delle Anime del Purgatorio, where all kinds of relics of souls that appear to claim masses in suffrage of their souls are exhibited, and most of them leave the burnt imprint of their footprints on everyday objects. But it is very likely that all this is a skillful Christian reinterpretation. It is possible that in all these stories of the restless dead surrounded by fire, there is an ancient memory of the ritual of cremation, preserved in the collective memory as an appropriate prophylactic solution for all types of death, especially the most problematic ones. A typical example of these stories of the incandescent dead can be found in the golden legend of Jacopo della Voragine in the chapter 159, in which a professor at the Sorbonne University asked a student who was seriously ill to return after his death to inform him of this condition. The student appeared to him with a parchment cape, all written with sophism and full of fire inside, to demonstrate that the punishment reserved to those who studied heretical doctrines. Also, in Eastern Christianity, we find miracles of fire related to an inadequate burial. This is the case of Prince Gleb, one of the two holy brothers and martyrs whose cult and hagiographies contributed to consolidate the incipient Christianization of Kievan Rus. The anonymous text, Narrative and Passion, and Encomium of the Holy Martyrs Boris and Gleb recount a series of posthumous miracles of the relics of the Holy Martyr brothers. For instance, it reads, regarding Gleb's corpse, its remainder lost lying in the wilderness, somewhere close to the river Smiadim, tributary of the river Dnieper, where he was thrown between two tree trunks. In this position of abandonment, however, the saint one lay during a long time. He remained entirely unharmed, for he led him not in oblivion and neglect, but gave sins. Now a pillar of fire was seen, now burning candles, said the text. There are other igneous signs well known in hagiographic traditions, such as the luminaries that warn of the burial of the Apostle St. James in Compostela in Spain, for example. It is complicated to say that this miracle have to do with a memory of the incineration, but it is a hypothesis worth exploring. A very ancient proof of how much the Christian ecclesiastical authorities were concerned about the change of ritual from cremation to burial and the possible sacrileges that could be produced can be found in a short but very interesting text, the Indiculus Superstitionum and Paganiarum, that is, Index of Superstitions and Pagan Customs, is from the index of a longer text, unfortunately lost, preserved in the Vatican Apostolic Library, datable to the 8th century and coming surely from Saxony at the time when the forced Christianization of this area, sponsored by Charlemagne himself, was taking place. The first two entries of the index, therefore, the most important in the selection made by the author, refer precisely to the funeral rituals and eventual pagan deviation that could be recorded in them. The first entry of the index, and the most significant from my point of view, reads on the sacrilege that can be committed in the burial of the dead, reveals how important were the funerary problems posed by the change of the ritual from cremation to burial. According to a careful reading of this small entry, we can deduce two very important things. The sacrilege of which the Indiculus speaks does not only refer to problems concerning the application of a correct Christian ritual to the deceased, burial instead of cremation, as we have already said, but to the moment of the death and to the life itself of the deceased. Therefore, the concept of sacrilege included the dead who have led a reprehensible life or have been on the margins of society, or people who have had some problem at the moment of their death. Let us remember that until the 18th century, the Catholic Church maintained the prohibition of receiving burial in a sacred place which at that time was still the interior of the churches, to the actors of theater and other people of manifestly dissolute life, and until the 20th century, the suicide could not be buried in a sacred place either, in a cemetery, for instance. The alteration of any ritual, however small, at the moment of death or burial, can provoke the death to return to life to claim the restitution of the ritual. We have a curious example in the story of a virtuous monk who nevertheless dies without wearing the cowl as prescribed by the rule of Saint Benedict. This is a story preserved by Cesarius of Heisterbach, and a monk dies without the cowl, and when dead in the church, rises and explains to his terrified companions that the angels have not let him enter paradise because he was not wearing his cowl, which according to the rule of Saint Benedict, monks have to wear at the moment of death. Once the cowl has been placed back on his corpse, the restless dead man becomes truly dead. So we can see that the problem is a very little problem, is only to wear the cowl properly, and this is not permit to enter paradise. The aggressiveness of the dead man is limited to the fright he gives to his brother monks. Thus, there is evidence that the aggressiveness of the returning dead is not a mandatory trait, so that all the returning dead need not necessarily be identified as vampires, as postulated by the binary stratification theory we have seen. More frequently, however, are the living dead who return because there has been some kind of unexpected death. The murdered, the suicidal, women who die in childbirth, and the most frequent cases are the most frequent cases. In the Germanic realm, we have abundant stories of this type. For instance, in the saga of the inhabitants of the Valley of Warfoot, we find a story in which a murdered person comes back to life. Ingvild organized the death of Claufi, her husband. Her brothers killed him and hid his body in a haystack. The same night, when Ingvild was in bed, Claufi got up and presented himself to her. She called the brothers, who took the living dead man, beheaded him, and placed his head on her at her feet. The undead does not get the revenge he is presumably seeking because the killers apply one of the remedies against the undead that we will talk about later. Let us now examine the first testimony of the living dead that we have located in the Slavic sphere. They are not very old, but they are full of very significant features, and I think they clearly corroborate what we are proposing. The texts we are going to discuss appear in the World Compendium of Roman and Bohemian Chronicles, written by Jan Neplach, abbot of the important Czech monastery of Opatovice, between 1360 and 1365. In this work, Neplach recounts the story of Bohemia up of 1346. The author ends his work in the years when Europe was severely punished by Black Death, a pandemic in which 1/3 of its population disappeared. Although the testimony that the authors select are chronologically prior to the pandemic, one must think that he writes for a society strongly stressed by fear. The first testimony goes like this. In the year of our Lord 1336, in Bohemia, close to Kadaň, along with a soldier in the town of Blov, a pastor named Mislata died, and he, rising from his tomb each night, would wander all of the nearby town, terrorizing and slitting the throats of the people, and he would speak. When pierced with a stick, he said, "Much damage you have done me, since you have given me a cane to defend myself from the dogs." And he was exhumated to burn him. He swelled like an ox and gave a hair-raising roar. When they put him in the fire, someone took a stick and drove it through him, and he bled without stopping, and if he were a tankard. In addition, when they disinterred him and put it in a cart, his legs shrunk as if we were alive, and when he was burned, all his evil was dispelled, and before being burned, all those whose names he spoke at night would die within 8 days. The living death of Bloch accumulates a remarkable series of typical traits of the harmful living death. He comes from a marginal social class. He dies in a non-normal way, perhaps accidentally and almost certainly without having received the sacraments. He is extremely aggressive. He continued to bleed and move after death. The remedy of piercing him with a stake is tried, but it does not work, and his damage only disappears when he is burned. That is, when the ancient funeral rite of cremation is applied to him. The second testimony is also very explicit. Year of the Lord 1334. In Levin, a woman died and she was buried. But then she would come out from her tomb and murder many, and then she would attack anyone. And when she was pierced, the blood flowed as if she were a live animal, and she had devoured more than half of the long shroud, which, when taken out of her, was covered in blood. When they went to burn her, they could not get any type of wood to light except the wood from the roof of the church, according to the testimony of some old woman. Although they had pierced her, she continued to rise up. But when they were able to burn her, all of the evil she had was dispelled. Although the author does not say so, it is not implausible that Levin's restless death also comes from a marginal stratum and was a witch or sorceress very frequent in Bohemia at this time, in accordance with the abundant ecclesiastical condemnation that we can read from this period of time. She received a conventional burial, but then emerged from the grave and becomes a very aggressive and restless dead woman who also bleeds as if she were alive. Levin's revenant manifests a characteristic that is general to this apparition. She is hungry, and this led her to devour her own shroud. As for its elimination, it is enormously resistant. Piercing it with a stake does not work, nor does burning it with conventional wood, and only when one resorts to a sacred wood, all the evil that she could carry out is eliminated. This sacred character of the wood reinforces even more the idea that one has to resort to the ancient ritual to eliminate this type of conflicting death. A characteristic of the ancient medieval undead that survives in contemporary retellings of vampire stories are the remedies applied to these revenants. One of them is preventive burials, the use of which date back to classical antiquity. The most frequent is to bury the dead with a big stone placed on his body that prevented him from rising, or with a sickle in the neck so that when rising, he or she decapitated himself or himself. This practice survived in Poland until the 19th century, as archaeologists have amply demonstrated, as instance the photograph in the slide. We have already seen an Icelandic example of that decapitation is a very effective way to kill a potentially dangerous undead. Another very frequent and popularized possibility in culture is the fight against vampire is to drive a stake through them. In reality, this is a variant of fixing the dead to the grave with a stone, because the aim is to fix them to the earth so that they cannot leave the grave, but in modern culture is not well interpreted. Already in the 11th century, Bishop Burkhard of Worms condemned in a decree the practice of this, which he attributed to the witches not properly Christianized, and would be therefore a sacrilege of a proper ritual funeral. The text that you have in the slide said that, for instance, women have the practice of pierce with a stake the newborn without being baptized, or the woman that cannot bring the child in, or dies in the childbirth. These people were pierced with a stake. And finally, the most frequent solution is cremation. That is to repeat the pre-Christian ritual that is understood to be perfectly functional in times of crisis, which would be further proof of how complicated it was in medieval Europe to change the traditional Indo-European ritual of cremation for that of burial. The second part of my presentation is about Slavic gods and goddesses of death and the underworld. It is very difficult to deal in a short time with all the problems of the structure of the pantheon of the Slavic gods. To make it very brief, we will say that the first scientific reconstruction of the Slavic pantheon, carried out by Lubor Niederle in 1996, defends the existence of a hierarchical pantheon similar to that of other Indo-European religious traditions, in which we will have at the top a god Perun, in a hierarchical position below Veles or Volos, god of meadows and cattle, and below Svarog, god of fires. Other authors have elaborated similar triads or with variants. In the most detailed testimonies of the veneration of the main god of the Slavs in the Eastern and Western sphere, we can see that from the 10th century onwards, this elegant situation has been restructured. Perun maintains the primacy in the renovated pantheon erected by Vladimir in Kiev in 880, placed it in a central position on the hill next to the palace. The idol of Volos, however, is placed in a lower position in the marketplace, as we can deduce from the account of the destruction of the idols in the life of Vladimir. In the Western zones, other gods assume primacy, mainly by virtue of their oracular prestige, as is the case of Svarogits or Radogost in the temple of Redra. This primacy is reinforced when the god assumes a polyfunctional condition: oracular god, god of the army or fertility, as is the case of Triglav in the temple of Setim, or Sventovit in the sanctuary of Arcona. This polyfunctionality is symbolically reinforced by the artistic expression of polycephalic idols: three heads in the case of Triglav, four in the case of Sventovit. According to most interpretation, the divinity that has the most acceptable characteristic to be reinterpreted as a lord of the underworld is Veles Volos, to which other types of the mythical elements are attributed. The best known is the one elaborated in 1874 by Ivanov Antoporov, who reconstructed an essential cosmogonic myth of Slavic paganism, not attested in any ancient text, in which the Slavic divinity of lightning, Perun, fights against the serpent, his archenemy, which they identify with the god Veles Volos. The reconstruction of this alleged myth is based on comparative testimonies with other Indo-European mythological traditions, such as Greek or Indian. The material on which they are based is above all iconographic and the reinterpretation of some folkloric testimonies. But what do the ancient texts really tell us about Veles Volos? Rather little. The oldest testimonies, which appear in the Tale of the Bygone Years, PBL, link him to Perun as the god's guarantor of a sacred oath in both texts of a peace treaty of the highest level between the Emperor of Byzantium and the Prince of Kiev. Beside that, the same epithet is always attributed to him, to Veles, no? The god of cattle. The text is in the slide. We have already alluded the position that the idol of the god Volos was not on the top of the hill of the palace as Perun, but in the lower city, near to the river Pochina. This position would indicate a lower hierarchical position, or would be linked to the cattle market, of which it seemed to be protector god. The testimony and the life of Vladimir. The first problem we face with this god is the variation in name. The variant Volos is the one that appears in the PBL, a monastic analytical history to recount the origin of Kievan Rus. Veles is more common in the later homiletic text. The variant would be in keeping with other vowel distribution in ancient Indo-European languages, where the vowel O and the vowel E may alternate under certain conditions. There are several etymological proposals to explain the theonym. The best known is the one elaborated by the Lithuanian American archaeologist and linguist Maria Gimbutas, who relates it to Lithuan Veles, shadows of the dead, and to Latvian Vels, god of the beyond, which would make Veles Volos a divinity related to the dead. A metaphorical reading of the cattle as the souls of the dead would support this interpretation. The dead would be like a herd of cattle, which in other mythological traditions, such as Vedic in India, is compared to cows. To guide this herd of souls, the Indo-European tradition created the dogs from the beyond the grave as guardians of the cattle, as for example, the dog Cerberus of Greek mythology. Therefore, the god Veles Volos would be the god of the real livestock, but also of the scatological livestock, the one composed of the souls of the deceased. But this is only a hypothesis based on comparative material. More complex is the analysis of the female figures that have been interpreted as goddesses of the underworld. The first one we will mention is Nia. Testimonies concerning a goddess Nia, who also presents a variant Tia, appear in Polish authors of the 15th century, such as Jan Długosz, in a cultural attempt to reconstruct a Slavic pantheon similar to the Greek or the Roman one. This character of an invented pantheon that wants to imitate the Roman pantheon in the midst of the Polish Renaissance makes the goddess suspect of being a Renaissance forgery. However, the etymology of the theonym Navia give us clues to relate it to some entities clearly from beyond the grave, such as the Navie that appear in Polosk in a wild hunt, killing the living, according to the PBL. The text says something very strange occurred in Polosk and a hallucination. There were a noise during the night. Demons were running through the street like people. If anyone came out of their house to look, they were immediately and invisibly wounded by the demons and died of it, and they did not dare leave their house. Then they began to appear during the days on horseback, and they themselves could not be seen, but only their horses' hooves were visible. And this is how they wounded the people of Polosk and of the region. And this is why the people say the dead are slaying the people of Polotsk. This is the Navie, no? The Navie are the living dead. The second divine figure we bring here is Morana or Marsana. The idea that a divine entity called Morana has to do with the dead and the afterlife comes exclusively from its etymology. Proto-Indo-European mer confer Latin mors mortis. However, its relation to death appear only in a forged gloss of medieval times. The folkloric use of Morana Marsana suggests rather that it is a figure linked to a spring ritual related to agriculture and fertility preserved in Bohemia and Czech Republic until today. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm sorry for my English, it's not so very good. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Juan Antonio Álvarez-Pedrosa, and thank you all for participating. If you have questions, please submit them through the Q&A. And before we go into the questions, I wanted to remind you that Dr. Álvarez-Pedrosa not only had the webinar today, but he also prepares some publishable materials. So materials that we at the center can publish on our website. And his references and the summary of his presentation today will be available on the center website. And I believe it's in the folder for the community. So if you're interested in looking at resources and looking at the summary, please search through the center website. One other thing I would like to remind you also is that once we finish the webinar, you will be asked to participate in a very short survey. The survey is there for us to learn if there are other topics that you may want to hear about it and how we did it this time. So please, it's only 3 questions. It will take no time for you to complete that survey. And as for the questions, so there was one thing that I was curious about, and it's a very minute part of your presentation. You mentioned that until the I forgot which century, but the Catholic Church would not allow actors to be buried
Yes. Yes.
the hollow ground. So what were actors? What was bad about them that they could not be buried in the
See,
church on grounds?
it is think by Catholic Church that theater is not a respectable matter, and it is a pernicious example for people that is transmit very bad examples of moral and life. So actors are penalized without being buried in sacred. For instance, the most known example is Molière. Molière was buried in a way
Outside of cemetery.
sí, sí, outside the church, because only the church is a sacred place, and this is usual. I know until the final of the 18th century. Yes, yes. For instance, we know that actors in Spain or France or Italy was not permitted to be buried in sacred place. Yes.
So there's another question. It's that a transition from the restless dead who were whose death could, or restlessness could be limited by either the stake or the fire, and then translation of that rituals to the modern culture of how to kill the vampire. They are slightly different. So how this evolution happened? Because it's, if the stake didn't work, the burning didn't work, then they had to use the holy wood from the church. But in the modern cultures, stakes works, and sunlight works. So that you mentioned that all the restless deaths, the records that you're looking at, they were related with the night appearances. So does this have to do anything with the modern vampires dying from fire, or from sunlight?
For light, yes, yes. I think that's a good idea for you. So it's the transition from the fire as a way of eliminating the restless dead, used in medieval period, to the daylight as a kind of fiery manifestation to eliminate the. Yes, it's a good point. Yes. Okay, but the stake is not good interpreted in Dracula. The stake is to fix the dead in the grave, not to rise up.
So the stake wasn't, from the beginning, the stake was not meant as a killing instrument. It was just for making them immobile in a way.
Yes, it's a prophylactic. Yes.
I really like that word. So we just heard the bells on the Century Tower of the University of Florida. So it means that our time is up. So thank you very much, Dr. Álvarez-Pedrosa, for joining us and talking about the restless dead and the Slavic gods of Underworld and goddesses. We have one goddess. This, unfortunately, is our last webinar in the Slavic mythology series. So thank you all for participation. Thank you for joining us. And maybe in the future, we will come up with another interesting topic that links Slavs with the rest of the world. So thank you and goodbye.
Thank you very much. Goodbye. Thank you to you all. Thank you.